Hi, everyone, and welcome to our project, presented to you by Michael, Morgan, Jenny, and Joe. For our project, we decided to focus on school tracking. This was a topic that was very interesting to us based off of the different things that we've been discussing over the last few weeks in class. Now, while school tracking is a very broad topic, if you will, what we were looking at is school tracking in the areas of elementary and secondary students within the US. Again, yes, very broad, but what we were hoping to accomplish is to be able to look at these different areas and kind of compare notes to see if there is any similarities or differences. And what we found was actually very interesting. So, some of the key questions that we are focusing on to kind of narrow in around this topic first is, how is school tracking implemented, right? So, thinking about who holds the power to make that decision of how it's implemented, what components go into it, what does that criteria look like, that rubric look like? Is it uniform or does it vary on a district by district basis? A lot of times we often forget that school systems look different depending on location or culture or what side of the world they're on. Then we wanted to look at, how does school tracking perpetuate segregation, right? Because essentially, if you think about it, we are grouping students based off of different factors, which we'll talk about in a moment. Then, lastly, we wanted to identify what perceptions are held by students on school tracking. As we go through different research and we learn different things, a lot of stuff is given from the perspective of the teacher, the researcher, the educator, the community, the politician. But how often do we actually take a moment to really analyze student voice, to ask them questions about what do they think about the school system? What do they think about the curriculum choices that they have? And when we take a moment to do that, the findings are unbelievable. In reality, student voice should be included a lot more often than what it is today, so that way we have that full perspective and perception on a topic. Furthermore, we're going to also look at, is there a difference amongst gender, ethnicity, race, or disability status? And also kind of comparing, what is the intersectionality between all of those? Does it impact or influence one another? So, what is a tracking system? Before we actually go into the definition of this, what we'll be covering today throughout our presentation is first giving you background and history on what school tracking is, where did it originate from, kind of give you the roots and the foundation of it. We'll talk about current practices. We'll look at different perceptions, if people agree with it, disagree with it, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages, and then wrapping up with implications of the tracking system. Now, when it comes to school tracking, how we define it is basically a leveling system that groups students based on academic ability, right? And ideally, this is coming from a means of accountability. So, the thought process behind this is, if we are grouping students based on their academic ability, they are all, in a sense, at the same level academically, so they can hold each other accountable throughout their educational journey. Now, we mentioned before, this differs across schools and districts. We added this quote on here that we found to be very interesting and really touched on what we were trying to accomplish here. And it's by Sal Khan, who gave a TED Talk. And he said, in a traditional academic model, we group students together, usually by age, and around middle school by age and perceived ability, and we shepherd them all together at the same pace. So, first, before we continue, I would like to just take a moment, just a few seconds, and we want you all to think about that quote and think about what that means to you. So, hopefully, you had a moment to reflect on that quote. For us, thinking about that, it makes so much sense, right? If you think about when a child is born And then as they grow, they become 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, and so forth. Usually they start school based off of their age. And then around middle school, it's by their age and their perceived ability. This really hit home for myself because I thought about where I was in middle school. All throughout my elementary, I went through my classes with people around my age group. But it wasn't until I got to middle school and I was tested further on my ability and was transitioned out of what they called regular classes into the gifted and magnet program, where I felt even more isolated than I did in my regular classes, being a woman of color and being the only one in my classes that represented my demographic. But continuing on our presentation, there are some questions that we found to be very interesting that we wanted to include that was taken out of Detracting for Excellence and Equity, an article by Carol Corbett Boris and Delia Garrity. And what they were doing is examining the present system in a school or district and how it begins with answering these following questions. And so these questions are: at what grade level are students first grouped for instruction? What is the rationale for starting to group at that grade level? And how many grouping levels are used? What influence does this grouping have on students' later instructional placement and educational opportunities? This number three question is also very important because thinking about using my story of if you were grouped in a certain group at such an early age, does that shift as you continue to go? Number four is: what assessments are the basis for placement decisions? Number five, how accurate and valid are these placement assessments? So, a lot of times when we think about these placement assessments, we often forget that every student is different. And so, when they are taking assessments, there can be someone that has a high academic ability, but maybe they're not great at taking assessments. So, is this a fair placement assessment? Are they accurate? Is that valid? And then, last but not least, how are the effectiveness of placement decisions assessed? Now, looking at the school tracking process. So, essentially, we start off as a homogeneous group, right? We're all the same. Then we get funneled out. So, funneled out through gender, ability, and then age. But if we look at ability, that gets pushed out even further. Ability can be looked at as AP classes, which is advanced placement, college preparation, or vocational training. And so this is at a glance what the school tracking process looks like. Now, kind of taking you down memory lane and going through the history of school tracking. Quoting Oakes, at its inception, intelligence was viewed as an innate ability, right? Innate ability. Tracking was response to immigration and labor at the turn of the 20th century, setting up separate high schools for special programs and groups vocational high schools for lower class immigrant youth, academic high schools with college preparation for the middle class. Most cities, however, develop comprehensive high schools to meet the needs of the variety of students who attended. An integral aspect of comprehensive high schools became the separation of students within them for different kinds of instruction. We wanted to share this quote with you from the Harvard Law Review from back in 1989. And it says, although schools have been tracking students since the 1920s, the practice has always rested uneasily with the principle of equal opportunity. Now, this one is very interesting because it kind of helps us to transition our thinking around school tracking and start to help us to look at how can this negatively or positively impact our educational system. Thinking about the evolution of school tracking, how it shifts from the past to now the present, By the end of the 20th century, 98% of high schools and 60% of elementary schools use tracking in some form or another. Now, this is very key to realize because if that's 98% of high schools and 60% of elementary schools, this is a process that more than the majority of the US is utilizing. So, what are the perceptions of that? Well, if we look at the advantages first, it allows for individualized instruction. If you think about it, yes, if we are grouping students based off of their academic ability, they are, in a sense, maybe on the same track, and so it's a lot more individualized for them. Students also receive appropriate educational pacing. Now, when we think about the disadvantages, it could be very harmful both socially and emotionally. Thinking back to some of the research that we shared with you, if students are first initially grouped by age when they're younger and then ability by middle school, that can be very harmful to them socially and emotionally. Socially, because let's say they've been friends with a certain group of students all throughout their academic years and then all of a sudden get separated out. One friend goes into AP, the other friend goes somewhere else. How does that impact them socially? And if we are separating them out, what is that doing to their emotional state? It also promotes a racial hierarchy and de facto segregation. Unfortunately, we often see situations where things like unconscious bias plays into effect. So maybe in some cases it's not just based on academic ability, there's gender, there's race, there's religion, there's all these other factors. And then it serves as a limiting factor in education. So if they are being grouped, students are being grouped through the school tracking system, does that hold them back from progressing in certain areas of their academics? Now, some concerns with this, well, it gives opportunities to succeed and learn in the higher track while promoting disadvantages in lower track students. We potentially can see bias, as I mentioned before, prejudice, discrimination, and difficulties arise when detracking. We decided to add this image in here because it's really interesting, kind of continuing this conversation around bias and segregation. On the left hand side, we see two students where it says below average, and then on the right side, it says above average. But it's interesting if you look at the way that even though this is a cartoon, how they decided to dress the students. The one on the left side seems like they are dressed in a more casual way, and by one of the students holding up the chair, maybe one can imply that they are rambunctious and wild kids. Where on the right, they're both wearing glasses, one has on a suit, one has on a dress, right? Reinforcing this notion around how school tracking and sorting students can be actually driven by bias. Now, thinking about the reality of school tracking, current research places an emphasis on outcomes rather than the processes that lead to disproportionality in special education. Standardized achievement and intelligent tests, along with subjective student evaluation methods used by schools, have been widely criticized as culturally biased. So, again, reinforcing how school tracking systems can essentially cause a lot of harm through being culturally biased. Going back to Oakes, the effects of tracking on IQ scores found that test scores of students in low tracks became homogeneized with a lower mean score over time. In contrast, student scores in higher tracks became increasingly differentiated with a higher mean score over time. Furthermore, track placement affected 11th grade achievement with students in college tracks experiencing greater gains than those in non college preparatory programs. And finally, here are a couple of quotes that we wanted to share with you. One is from Candace Sumner. Through her TED Talk, she said, teaching my kids about desegregation, the Little Rock Nine, and the civil rights movement is a real awkward moment in my classroom. When I have to hear the voice of a child ask, if schools were desegregated in 1954, how come there are no white kids here? Again, reinforcing what we said in the beginning about how important it is to include student voice and to ask them questions because they are thinking critically in the way that we should be about our educational system. Finally, we would like to leave you with this last statistic. Black students are underrepresented in gifted and talented programs by as much as 47%, while Hispanic students are underrepresented by 36%. So, as we come to a close, we hope that you all learn more about school tracking and what a tracking system is. The way that we are utilizing this system to group students together based off of their academic ability, their gender, their race, and different other factors, and how it could be an advantage in some cases, but more than not a disadvantage in other areas. And thinking about how this differs across the US and across districts, and just depending on different cultures as well. We hope you enjoyed our presentation. If you ever have any questions or want to learn more, please check out our resources at the bottom or feel free to reach out to any of us. Thank you so much. Have a great day.